If that had been the sound of gunfire and bombs, it could not have been more revolutionary than the music we've just heard. The Rite of Spring was Stravinsky's third ballet, and those in its first audience at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris in 1913 didn't know what had hit them. Well, one man did. His name was Karl van Vechten, and like everyone else at that historic first night, it was something he never forgot.
A certain part of the audience was thrilled by what it considered to be a blasphemous attempt to destroy music as an art, and, swept away with wrath, began very soon after the rise of the curtain to make catcalls and to offer audible suggestions as to how the performance should proceed. The orchestra played unheard, except occasionally when a slight lull occurred. The young man seated behind me in the box stood up during the course of the ballet to enable himself to see more clearly. The intense excitement under which he was labouring betrayed itself presently when he began to beat rhythmically on top of my head with his fists. My emotion was so great that I did not feel the blows for some time. By that time, the police had arrived to quell what had turned into a full-scale riot. Stravinsky was horrified, but the great impresario Diaghilev, who had commissioned the work, rubbed his hands together in delight. This, he cooed, is exactly what I'd hoped for. He knew perfectly well, he was a man who could trust his hunches, that he had a classic on his hands which would sooner or later become a staple of the repertoire. A year or so afterwards, the conductor of that opening night, Pierre Monteux, presented the work again, but in concert, and the riot this time was of applause. After the concert, Stravinsky was carried shoulder-high through the streets, little guessing even then that decades later the Rite would be regarded by many musical historians and pundits as the key work of the 20th century, just as he would be regarded by very many people as the greatest of its composers. Very early on, Stravinsky decided that he far preferred the Rite as a self-contained and self-sufficient concert work without any reference to a scenario. And it's as a concert work that we'll be exploring it. It's interesting, though, that Stravinsky, who was one of the all-time great ballet composers, actually disliked the very idea of illustrative music. For him, and this too in its way was a bit revolutionary, music was not an accompaniment to the ballet was rather an extension of the music. Needless to say, not all choreographers agreed with him, but where the Rite is concerned, they tend to. And it has to be admitted that as plots go, the storyline here is simple almost to a fault. The ballet has its origins, so Stravinsky tells us, in a strange vision he had while he was working on his first ballet, The Firebird. "I saw in imagination," he writes in his autobiography, "a solemn pagan rite, wise elders seated in a circle, watching a young girl dance herself to death. They were sacrificing her to propitiate the god of spring." And that basically is it, though obviously it's all fleshed out a bit from that. One thing more, though, before we set off. Those who think of spring in terms of daffodils, cherry blossoms, bunny rabbits, and birdsong tend to be disconcerted by the amount of violence, even savagery, in the Rite. One clue to it can be found in Stravinsky's answer to being asked in old age what he had loved most about his native Russia. He replied, "The violent Russian spring that seemed to begin in an hour and was like the whole earth cracking. That was the most wonderful event of every year in my childhood." And somewhere else he describes the amazing, awesome sound as the thick ice of Russia's deep-frozen rivers breaks up, not an earthquake, but an icequake. Anyway, on to the music.